Hello everyone, welcome to Coffee Breaks with the Texas Institute for Child and Family Wellbeing. Coffee Breaks is our way for our followers to connect with us on Facebook Live as we talk with local professionals, leaders, advocates who are dedicated to improving child and family well-being. Just a few announcements before we begin. If you're looking to receive CEUs, you had to sign up in advance on our website. If you've already signed up, please comment that you are here in the session right now or comment at least once during the session. Once the session is over, we'll be sending you an evaluation via email, and it'll also pop up in the comments section of this Facebook Live. So let's go ahead and get started. My name is Monica Faulkner, and I'm the director of the Texas Institute for Child and Family Wellbeing. And with me today, I'm really excited to have my friend Ashley Harris, who is a very tireless child welfare advocate in the community. And this month, Ashley, is both Foster Care Awareness Month and Teen Pregnancy Prevention Month. And you have worked on both of these issues kind of very uniquely.
Yes, I have.
So I know from my practice experience, I started working with teens in foster care and really kind of noticing some disturbing patterns in terms of teen pregnancy prevention, and this was many years ago, but I remember kind of looking for resources and information about what we're doing with this population. You know, it was things like 14-year-olds coming into care who are already pregnant, or 10-year-olds asking for pregnancy tests because they had been sexually abused and they weren't even really sure what sex is or how babies were made, and so that really got me looking into what information was out there. And at the time, there was nothing, but now we know a little bit more. There's still a long ways to go.
Yeah, I had a similar experience as a former CPS caseworker for over 4 years, and I worked specifically with transitioning foster youth, and so I also saw some alarming trends in just the lack of information and resources that the youth had access to. And also as a caseworker, I feel like I didn't have the resources and supports needed to be able to talk to youth about sexual health, their choices and options when it comes to an unwanted pregnancy. That once I got out of the system and was really able to think about some of those trends and maybe some more of the systemic issues, that I really took the opportunity to dive into this from a policy, at a policy level.
And so I know one of the things that is most often cited is the rate of pregnancy among foster youth, where we know that about half, right, will get pregnant before they're 18, compared to the normal population, which would be around 30% overall. And then we see that number jump dramatically, right? By the time they're 21, we've got about 75%, I think, if I remember correctly, who have been pregnant. But one of the things we never knew until you came around was what is the rate in Texas? What are we seeing in Texas foster care? So can you talk a little bit about your efforts, the last legislative session, and what we now know?
Absolutely. So last legislative session, with the passage of Senate Bill 206, which was the DFPS sunset bill, we were able to tag on an amendment that required the department to collect information on the number of pregnant and parenting foster youth, including the number of those children that actually come into DFPS conservatorship, so into the custody of the department. And the department did report on that, although there's still some missing information that we need. But it showed about, based on data from Star Health, that over 330 foster youth were pregnant in fiscal year 2016.
Is that they became pregnant in that fiscal year, or?
Yeah, well, that they were pregnant. So
it just depends.
Right.
Okay.
And it's based on the Star Health claims data.
Right.
So they were receiving services related to pregnancy. But there were over 400 youth that that the department identified that were parents.
Right.
While they were also in the foster care system. There were some limitations, though, with the data collection, because the way the department gathered data on the number of parents that are foster youth, they just rely on data from whatever the caseworker or information that is in the DFPS impact system, which is not always reliable. I was a caseworker. I didn't always update a child's profile.
Right.
And so there's some limitations around that. Also, and I apologize, the department did report on the number of children that were born to minor youth.
Yeah.
They did report on the number of those children that did subsequently come into the conservatorship of the department, but they only reported on the number of infants that were born in fiscal year 16 that subsequently came into the custody of the department. So that doesn't necessarily include, the older children of youth that may have come into the system later.
Right. That they came in with their child.
Right.
Okay. And so that always was kind of a gray area, right? Because when you have a teenager who has their own child, it gets into this really weird kind of territory, right? And I know I experienced this where, there was a case of child abuse or neglect related to the teen parent, but not to that teen parent's child. And so it was always kind of an interesting situation of like, who has custody of that child? What are the rights of the teen mom versus the system, and really trying to understand that is so complicated. And so what have you seen in terms of resources for how do we work with teen parents in foster care?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of room for improvements as it relates to those foster youth who are parents.
Right.
I would say there's not a lot of placement options for those young parents. It's very difficult to place foster youth who have children. There's limited, dedicated providers to serve and support this population of young people, and I think we've got to do a better job at really developing foster homes that are trained and understanding the needs of those young parents, but also supporting them in being a successful, safe, and healthy parent, setting them up for success so we can end that cycle of child welfare involvement for these young parents. I also think one improvement that has been made is that the Department of Family and Protective Services, their prevention and early intervention program, has done more to target foster youth who are parents, to really connect them with services to ensure that they have the skills needed to be safe and successful parents. So I'm hoping that the state can further strengthen that prevention programming targeting for foster youth, but these youth have very specific needs and have had very unique experiences, so it's really meeting them where they are and ensuring that we actually have services that are very specifically and uniquely developed for them.
Right. And so I think in general society would agree, like, let's raise our children so that they have their own children when they are ready.
And if they want to.
If they want to. But it's hard to get there. Like when you're in foster care, I know from my research, one of the things that I've really pointed out is we may have sex ed in schools. In Texas, we really don't have much. Our kids generally don't even know general anatomy, depending on what school district they're in, because it's all localized. But then also, even if a foster youth would get that information in school, they move schools so much that the chance that they are enrolled in a health class where they're going to get that information is really slim. And so there's a huge struggle with just getting them the information. And then the other part that I think is incredibly concerning is that the information that comes to them is not often in a trauma-informed way.
Absolutely, yeah. Those are two things I think that we have to prioritize in terms of solutions. Are first making sure youth have access to information that allow them to be able to make healthy decisions about their bodies, be able to practice safe sex if they choose to have sex. And the other thing, that you mentioned is so many of these young people have experienced trauma, that their introduction to sex was traumatic. Yeah. And so a lot of the messaging that young people, and I know you've done a lot of work on this and research on this, a lot of the messaging that young people receive about sexual health is very shaming. And I think that for foster youth in particular, we've got to ensure that they they know that when they want to talk about these issues, that they're going to be, empowered, in a healthy way
right.
to talk about these issues.
Right. And I know there's been a lot of research that has kind of confirmed for us that foster youth have poor outcomes when compared to youth in the general population. Pretty much any social, emotional, educational indicator, foster youth are going to do worse off. But when we look at kind of sexual health outcomes and we look at teen pregnancy prevention, what I have found and what's pretty consistent across the literature is that sexual abuse is going to be that main factor that drives negative sexual behaviors. None of the teen pregnancy curricula, including the one that's marketed for youth in out-of-home care, address sexual trauma. And here's what's so fascinating is you have sexual health educators who are super comfortable with discussing sex, but they don't want to talk about the trauma.
Absolutely.
That scares them. And then we have child welfare folks, foster parents, CPS workers, who are really in tune with trauma and getting people what they need. They don't want to talk about sex.
Yep. And
so there's kind of no middle ground of where we've seen a successful effort to take that sexual trauma and blend it into a sex ed curricula, where we can teach kids that sex is not a horrible thing. It can be a really good part of your life when you are ready for it, when you're mature enough for it. And that's what ultimately we want for you in adulthood, but we don't get people to that place. And so I think we're kind of back to this place of like, oh, we don't know what to do, so we're just not going to talk about it.
Absolutely. And I can tell you, I've talked with providers, and Monica, you developed a training that I hope to see be expanded across the state, Brave Conversations, where you're blending those two perspectives. And I think caregivers want that. I mean, I've talked to providers, and they're like, we have no idea how to bridge, trauma-informed care with sexual health, and we want that. We also are afraid about liability. If we talk about sexual health, then that's a pass for a young person to, but we've got to set up everyone for success, including youth and caregivers, to where everyone has the information they need to be able to make healthy decisions, and caregivers are put in that place of empowering young people.
And you had mentioned you had talked with some foster youth recently, and they had said, why can't they just talk to us?
Yeah.
And we've seen that in other research too, just in doing a needs assessment in Austin, where youth were like, why can't they just talk to us? We already know about this from TV and everything else.
Yes.
Why can't they just talk to us? And the real issue there behind that is adults don't talk to really any kids about this.
Right.
So to kind of put it on a foster parent, I mean, it is tough. But I think we have to step up and take responsibility for raising healthy kids. So there's one comment in here I'm going to read. We need a central repository of research-based resources to help foster parents support these children. Maybe UT could house this. We could house that. However, there aren't really any research-based resources, which is one thing that we're trying to really develop. So
in regards to the trauma-informed
sexual health. So we have a training that you mentioned that we do, and we were able to train quite a few foster parents in Central Texas. And I have to tell you, like, it's my favorite thing to talk to foster parents because they're awesome and amazing. But in training them and coming in and talking about sex, they'll kind of sit there and be really quiet. Then at the end, they kind of grab onto me and are like, okay, you're going to come back, right? We're going to talk about this more. So they want the info. But the unfortunate part of this is research has really just defined the problem.
Right.
Which is ironic because practitioners already knew what the problem was.
Absolutely.
But researchers have spent a lot of time looking at data to show you that, there's a higher rate. We have one evidence-based teen pregnancy prevention curricula that was designed, it was modified from another one to serve youth in foster care. But really a lot of those modifications, as I've kind of dug into it and evaluated it more, kind of missed the boat in terms of allowing a discussion into trauma. And some of the elements in it are traumatic in and of themselves.
Absolutely, and I think that that's where a lot of the application and the work needs to happen is how to talk about the past trauma, be able to address the past trauma and empowering that young person as it relates to sexual health decisions. And that's even challenging for me, and I've worked with young people, for many years, that even when I talk to young people now about ways to strengthen trauma-informed reproductive health information, it's hard for me because the last thing I want to do is bring up something that could trigger them or re-traumatize them. But if we're just ignoring it, we're not getting down to kind of those root causes and meeting the child where they're at and providing what they need.
Yeah, and I would say I've had a lot of discussions with people about, well, what's better, abstinence or comprehensive sex ed? And I kind of come at it and say, honestly, I don't really care as long as it's trauma-informed. Because making something trauma-informed takes out that element of shame. A lot of the curricula talk in terms of, if you have an STD or you got pregnant, it's your fault.
Right. Life is over.
It's your fault. and they fail to kind of acknowledge the fact that in that room, there is a girl or a boy who has been sexually abused, and they might not understand the difference between forced and coerced sex and something that they would consent to, but the message they're hearing is, you are bad. You are bad. And I don't want any child to hear that message. And so for me, it's not even an argument of what is the long-term goal. It's just do it from a trauma-informed perspective, because one, you don't know who's in the room. And two, we can kind of lift that shame off of this discussion so that kids can actually trust that adults are going to engage in a conversation.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
Let me see. So in terms of, this is a great point. There's a lot of kinship placements, and luckily the legislature has decided that they're going to support those a little bit more. So that's a harder population to get to, kinship providers.
Yeah, I think when we think about solutions, it's not a one-size-fits-all, especially when it comes to maybe more training for caregivers and curriculum. That we have to think about other populations of caregivers that may not be supported by a private child placing agency, that are required to take all of this training. Right. Also culturally, we have to address the cultural differences that some families have when it comes to sexual health and in your body, that we have to recognize that. So to me, that just means we need to connect with those kinship caregivers and say, what would help them? We all want the same outcome, right. But what resources do they need, or training do they need to be able to support a youth's success?
Yeah, I can.
And we don't do that enough with kinship caregivers. We don't engage them in the solution so often, but I do think that by providing more financial support to them, that we can really show them that we value, as a state, we value their opinion, we value the role that they play, and we necessarily can't do everything the same that we do with foster parents for them as kinship caregivers.
Right. But we could definitely use community resources, I think, to connect them.
Absolutely.
To some of those. So we had a question about House Bill 3859. And I think we have a lot of opinions on it, but this specific question was asking, in terms of teen pregnancy prevention, what do we think that this bill is going to contribute? And so can you kind of give the basics of what this bill does?
Absolutely. And I will admit, I didn't work the legislative session this year. I took a break, and there was a lot going on in child welfare, but I have stayed attuned to House Bill 3859, and ultimately this really provides caregivers and child placing agencies the ability to not be it just opens the door for them to be able to deny certain placements for certain youth. As it relates to this topic, it opens a door for caregivers to deny youth access to contraception, contraceptives, emergency contraceptives, and even abortion, despite the fact that they may be the youth's desire. So to me, it kind of undermines all of the work that we've done to empower youth voice and a youth's rights. And I do see a potential impact on pregnancy prevention efforts, as this just makes it that much more challenging for you to have access to those very helpful resources if they do choose to have sex, that protects them against sexually transmitted infections and also pregnancy. And so I do see potential harm for this. The bill does, and it's based on a caregiver's sincerely held religious beliefs, although that's not defined. There's a provision in there that talks about a secondary provider being available to then respond to that, a child's request. But that system's not in place, and I really don't see that feasible given all of the demands that CPS has to deal with already, and the fact that we just don't have the number of providers, to be able to respond to these children.
So, and I know when I was working with youth at a shelter facility, we would definitely have kids come in. They were already using birth control pills, and they would be able to continue using that. But I did hear stories about, well, I couldn't stay there because I need to be on the pill, and they wouldn't let me. So I feel like that sort of discrimination was already happening, and I feel like caseworkers were attuned to whether or not this family could really meet the needs of this teenager, and they would kind of try to shift placements. But at the same time, that's incredibly traumatic to a kid to be like, oh, you're sexually active, and so you can't be in our home. And some of them weren't even sexually active. It was just they were put on birth control pills and they stayed on them. And I always felt that was very shameful.
Yeah, I think that you mentioned there are a couple things to that. There's as it relates to 3859, I think they are getting those messages. I've talked to a group of young people. They're getting those messages from their caregivers. If you have sex, I'm kicking you out of this placement.
Right.
They're getting that. I've witnessed that as a caseworker. I've even witnessed, say a young person thought they were pregnant. I've even witnessed a caregiver telling a young person, if you have an abortion, I'm kicking you out of this home.
Right.
I mean, these are the messages that so many of our young people are getting. Not only that, a group of young people I spoke with in Houston said CPS caseworkers are telling them if they get pregnant, they're going to take their baby. CPS will take their baby away.
Yeah.
So they're getting all these negative messages, and that I think that this just 3859 just opens the door for those type of messages, and not only that, practices.
To be okay.
It's okay versus before that wasn't okay, and caseworkers would try and manage some of those challenges with the caregiver. Have some more courageous conversations with them about the harm that those type of messages are doing. And then as it relates to forcing you to be on birth control, I've heard the same thing. Right. Now, what's interesting is the youth I talked to in Houston, that wasn't something that was a challenge. There was really no consequence for them not being on birth, if they choose not to be on birth control. But again, that is also not empowering young people to take ownership of those decisions. Right. So once they leave care, I can tell you, these youth are getting off birth control. They're not taking their psychotropic. They're doing everything to show that, to feel like they have some sort of ownership over their lives and their decisions. Mm-hmm. So we should be allowing that, engaging youth in a way that says, this is why taking birth control is good for you, but what do you think would be best for you? Mm-hmm. Letting them practice those skills that are needed to be successful as an adult.
Right. Mm-hmm. In a kind of shame-free type
Absolutely.
Zone. Right. Yeah, it's really tough. So I agree. Like, I think that these practices that people are talking about in terms of this legislation, we know that they've already been happening. Like, if you've ever worked on the ground level, you've seen it. Mm-hmm. But you've also known, like, it's not okay. You can't do that. Right. And we used to have in the Foster Care Bill of Rights some protections for those types of things. Now we don't necessarily have that because that was changed. So it's interesting because this legislation is almost solidifying that sort of discrimination and control over a young person's body and life.
Absolutely.
And so, I mean, it is very concerning in that sense. And there's certainly philosophical differences, right? Mm-hmm. Like, some people will always say, well, I am, 40 years old and I've lived life and I know much more than a 16-year-old. I generally push back on that and say, you might have been 16, but you're not 16 now, and you're not that kid, and you haven't gone through what that kid's gone through.
Right.
And so my general feeling is we need to look at what the youth's perspective is and kind of honor their right
Absolutely.
to control their body. And this legislation, I think, is taking that away.
Absolutely, and none of the language in the bill acknowledges a youth's right to decisions about their body. Just the fact that they're a key part of the decision-making process. It's their life. This bill does not, address that.
Okay. So just a lot of discussion about shame-free and empowering, and I agree. So we have kind of a larger issue too in Texas, right? So a lot of people don't realize this, but health class in Texas is no longer mandatory, so you can choose to take it as a high school student. Most high school students are not going to choose to take it. And health class was where you got the sex ed education. So what was mandated that had to be in sex education was mandated through that health class. So now school districts have an option, and they get to choose what sex ed program that they would like to use, and the legislature is required that if you do use one, it has to be an abstinence-based program. It's fine. There's not a lot of evidence-based abstinence programs, so that's kind of an issue of we don't really know what we're teaching. But we also have like generations of parents who have gone through Texas education system who don't even know the basics. I know as a social worker, I've seen women who have had, 5 children and could not name their body parts for you. When you're talking to them about a sexual assault, they cannot name their body parts. And that's really concerning. And to me, that's very much a failure of our families and our education system, that we don't even have basic anatomy taught to our kids. And so that is a huge part of this issue. The other part of it is, let's say a child wants this information and they try to find a clinic where they can get information. That's a huge barrier.
Absolutely.
Because for foster youth, how do you get to that clinic?
Right.
Someone's got to take you there, or you have to have permission to go on the bus. Foster children are generally have a lot of parental monitoring to where they're not going to be able to just go and do something on their own. And then the other issue with that is, even if they got to a clinic, they can't go in and get confidential services without a parent's permission.
Right.
And so we put a lot of barriers in the way that are really exacerbated by foster care. And the fact that youth really need those. So what it's a lot.
It is a lot. And I think it's also really important that what we're hearing from young people too when we talk about efforts to prevent pregnancy and sexually transmitted infections is that they also are looking for more information on healthy relationships, self-esteem, self-worth. So I think for foster youth in particular that information is also kind of critical and intertwined with talking about their bodies and making healthy decisions for themselves, is that they have that's also kind of included in what information we're providing them.
Yeah. So, let me see how it breaks down by region. So a question was asked about the, I don't know if it's the numbers by region. Oh, let me address this issue. The normalcy training, could this be part of normalcy training? I think it could absolutely be part of normalcy training, because the teen relationships are part of that normalcy. And I mean, I know we've had kids who were not even sexually active, but just like having a girlfriend or boyfriend, and that was frowned upon, and that's a normal thing, that we need them to have those relationships within that, while they're with that family, so that family can help guide
them,
provide information on how to be in a relationship. And so, yes, I think it should be part of the normalcy training, absolutely. I want to go ahead and wrap up and just give you a couple pieces of information. We really want to thank you guys who joined us today, and if we haven't gotten to your comments yet, Ashley and I can answer your question in the comment sections later. We would really appreciate your feedback, even if you aren't receiving CEUs. So please fill out the evaluation that's been linked in the comment section. If you've signed up for CEUs, the evaluation form will be emailed to you today, and you'll receive your certificate of attendance within a week. And please join us for other coffee break sessions. We're really trying to figure out ways to kind of get pieces of information out to people in the field, but we'd also really like to hear from y'all too about what you're interested in. So if you do have questions about this topic, you can put them in the comments section. You're also welcome to email me later, and if I don't know the answer, I can get with Ashley and we'll figure out a response to you. So thank you.
Thank you.